Hello all and welcome to this presentation about accelerating the quality of your FHIR implementations. Today your speaker is Richard Ettema. Welcome Richard. Go ahead and start your session.
All right, let me share my screen. All right, hopefully that's coming through. All right, thank you. So yes, my name is Richard Ettema. This is Accelerate Quality, Building FHIR that meets federal mandates. So who am I? Well, I'm the lead architect of Touchstone, which is from my company aegis.net. I am also HL7 FHIR proficient, and I've been doing this for a long time. Most notably the last 7+ almost 8 years now with the FHIR specification with a focus on testing. I'm also the author of our Aegis Wildfire public test server and client. And not listed here, I'm also the co-chair of the Whiskey SIG at the working group meetings. So if you've ever been to the working group meetings and are interested in whiskey, please join us for the Whiskey SIG. For this session, our learning objectives are an overview of the FHIR Testing Framework within the FHIR specification. So we'll do a brief flyby of that. But then we'll talk about the importance of FHIR validation testing, some of the challenges that we have, and what the 5 W's of testing are. And then we're going to get into Touchstone as a FHIR testing platform where we have program testing, where we are working with the Drummond group and their certification programs. So we'll be looking closely at one of those programs and seeing how with Touchstone we have facilitated the testing of that for certification for those programs. So first and foremost, within the FHIR specification since DSQ2, so it's been around for quite a while, there's this concept of a testing framework. And this was incorporated into the FHIR spec so that we could ensure a standardized way of making sure applications or implementations that claim to be conformant to the FHIR specification, we have a way to actually test that. The framework itself defines a test script resource as a natural language computable format of that test case or test definition. The link to the test script resource is there in the main spec. The framework itself also defines how a FHIR test engine must execute its workflow. So when it's processing these test scripts, what are the things that are going to be happening within the FHIR engine, test engine itself? And again, there's a whole testing page within the FHIR specification that defines this. Most notably, that test execution workflow is designed around basic steps that you might think of in any testing paradigm, where we have pre-processing of the test script or scripts that are going to be executed. And so we determine those test scripts, we parse through them and look at what's going to be tested, matching the capabilities of the system under test to what's being tested. So that pre-processing allows us to establish the parameters, if you will, and the metadata around testing. And then we get into the actual execution flow where we have a setup operation. So within each individual test script, there's going to be a setup that contains a number of operations as well as assertions that are going to follow to make sure that the system under test is properly prepared. So we could query and make sure certain resources exist. We could actually create resources on the system for subsequent testing. Test execution, which I've starred, is what we're going to talk about just a little bit more, is where the actual testing occurs. So this is where operations and assertions are going to be performed that are going to contribute to the overall success or failure of the test execution. Once those have completed, we go through a teardown execution. This is an optional step where if we want to, we could revert the system under test back to its pre-test state. So you might think of delete operations to remove anything that might have been created, and so on. And then finally, from a test engine perspective, post-processing. So all of that execution data is going to be collected and then provided in some fashion to the user so that they can examine the results. And so whether on a UI or whether through some API where we can pull back those results for future examination. The test execution itself, and this is true for the setup as well as the teardown, we have operations that are going to be performed. So within each test, within each test script, and there can be multiple test groupings with multiple operations in them. The idea here is that the operation basically is one of the FHIR RESTful API interactions that are going to be executed. A FHIR test engine is required to support all the operations within the FHIR specification, as well as the extended operations framework, those $ prefixed operations as well. It's important to understand that when you define an operation within the test script and it gets executed, it's going to get executed, regardless of whether you're going to be testing that execution or not. So it's interesting, you can execute something, but then not test it. So the execution is not really testing anything, it's just performing that operation. But then what follows then is one or more asserts, which are the rules that are going to be used to evaluate against the results of that operation. So the request, response payloads, headers, so on and so forth. So an assert will always act on the current most recently executed operation, and it is essentially a condition, rule, or expression. They support XPath, JSON path, even FHIR path. And that's going to be evaluated against the executed operation context. And very simply put, if the assert is true, if the evaluation is true, the assert passes. And the converse is true. If it evaluates to a false, then that will be a failure. We do have options to allow for warning onlys and so forth. So if you have, let's say in the specification, your shoulds versus shalls. So maybe there's a should that you should be doing, but it's not a firm requirement. It's more of an optional thing that we would like you to do, but we don't want to necessarily ding you on it, but we want to give you a warning. So we do have flags that we can set for assertions if those come out to be things like, the shoulds as opposed to shalls. The test script resource itself, again, first-class resource within the FHIR specification. It is that representation of the executable test definition for looking at the results of those RESTful API interactions. So an example that I like to give here is very simply, what if we wanted to test something like a patient search and then validate the response or responses? Well, for example, we might require to support that a number of existing patient resources. So they might already exist on the system under test, or you might think about things like the setup within a test script. Maybe we could create what we needed for the search. So we might have a setup where we create 1, 2, 3, or more, and we could do it in a batch or a transaction as well as individual create update type statements. The setup procedure then would establish that test data, and then we follow that with whatever test or tests we want to do, which would be one or more different search operations. Based on the known test data, then, we could evaluate the results. If I have 3 patients that match certain criteria out of the 100 or so that I might have, I might test to make sure I only get back those 3 that I'm searching for. Once we're all done with all of our testing, we'll then put into the teardown a procedure to clean up our test data. Other ways of doing this might be in the setup as well, too, where you would first delete everything and then perhaps create everything. You can think of like a purge operation of your test data and then a batch to repopulate the data prior to the test. And that's just a nice thing to do when you're testing, is you want to make sure that you start with a known state and then you finish with a known state as well. Okay, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail there. The FHIR specification includes a lot of information already there on the testing framework as well as the test script. We'll actually see some test scripts when I get into the demonstration later on in the presentation when I get into Touchstone. The next section here is, of course, looking at the importance of FHIR validation testing. And here, this is, what are some of the challenges that we're looking at when we're doing testing? And all of this revolves around interoperability challenges. So we can think first and foremost about implementing the specification. But a lot of times that's often done through the lens of interpretation. So even with the FHIR specification, if someone were to hand that spec off to one implementer and then to a second, and they didn't communicate, they didn't go and talk to each other, we might see different implementations come out of that. They might be pretty close, but there will be variations there. And so that's one of the challenges we have, is we want to be able to make sure that implementations are consistent in how they implement according to the specification. A lot of times we're limited in our testing partners. So I might work with org A, and that organization has a FHIR system that I'm going to test with. But if that's the only testing partner I have, I'm not really fully vetting my system very well. I need to probably have a lot of testing partners, and we're often limited in who we have. I also think about happy path testing. So if I have a test partner external, they're probably going to want to make sure that their system is following everything correctly. Well, what if I want to do negative testing? So if I think about, well, what if I send something bad or receive something bad? So am I going to ask my testing partner to break their system per se, so that I can test the negative aspects of the specification, like when should I generate correct error messages and payloads and so forth, get that operation outcome to come back the way it should. So, that's a challenge as well, too. Another common misconception is, again, when we get back to limited testing partners, but if I have two systems interacting and they interact well, does that mean they're fully interoperable? Well, between the two of them, sure. Well, what happens when I introduce system 3 and 4 and 5 and so on? We start getting into that same problem where multiple implementations, if they're not doing it all the same way, then we got to go back and re-engineer, rework things. So it's important that successful testing allows us to look at all of these different scenarios, and successful testing is multifaceted and needs to take into account real-world conditions as well, too. Now, in terms of the 5 W's, so this is the first one is why. Why do we test? Well, probably because we have to. A lot of times we have certification that we have to get through, so there's requirements and rules, and so most notably here in the US we have the CMS Interoperability and Patient Access Final Rule, ONC with its final rule guidance for the 21st Century Cures Act. There's been previous talks on these already, so I don't have to go into a lot of detail, but the idea here is that these programs require certain functionality to be in place above and beyond just the base FHIR specification. So they're going to leverage various implementation guides, and we need to be compliant to those. So the why here is to prove our compliance to or conformance to rules and regulations. Additionally, continuous interoperability. We test to ensure that we remain interoperable over time, against ever-evolving standards. So within our ecosystem, which could be regional, national, whatever it might be, we want to make sure that we're continuously testing to ensure we have continuous interoperability. Now, who should test? Well, basically anybody building a system, especially if it needs to meet certain program certification requirements, the two that I've just mentioned. So if you're an implementer, software vendor, and you want to make sure that you're compliant, you're going to be following certain rules and regulations, implementation guides, and so forth. You want to be able to test that your system, though, complies to those. So you need some sort of way to do that, whether internally, definitely internal testing is appropriate, but also from an independent testing environment as well, too. Outside of just that, making sure that you as an implementer, you want to verify that your systems are truly interoperable, and you want to validate that they conform to the base FHIR specification as well as other implementation guides, so outside of certification per se. And then implementation guide authors, part of the process of building an implementation guide, the IG publishing process, does a great job of ensuring that what's being published is good, but it's important to take those profiles once they've been built and test them out in real-world situations, so in testing environments where example resources or generated resources are actually looked to against those profiles to see if they're compliant or conformant. And a lot of times you'll see as implementation guides are being developed, the profiles will be going undergone different changes and enhancements and so forth as, hey, did that constraint really work the way it was supposed to? Is that extension the one that I really want? Is that making sense? That type of thing. So it's not just simply actual conformance, but also usability as well too. So what should we test? Well, there's that word interoperability again. Sound like a broken record, but it's really why we're here. So what we're testing is conformance to the specification, to the implementation guide, validating the use of standard and extended RESTful API operations, building the implementation guide, making sure that as we build that implementation guide, we're following the standards, make sure the examples are correct, the scenarios we're defining are correct, and again, certification, the rules and regulations based on those various programs. And then, of course, when should we test? Well, basically, our mantra here is test early, test often. So during and throughout the life cycle of any implementation, development, QA, integration, pre-post production, every step along the way, we encourage testing to be done. So as soon as you've got a RESTful API ready to go and you want to make sure that it's working, you should probably give it a good test locally, internally, but also independently as well too. Part of those certification programs, whether it's an initial or annual recertification, Connectathon events, great opportunity for testing because that's what they're for. But don't just think about testing during the Connectathon event, also think about before as well as after the events. So it's important to continue the conversation. And as we go from one Connectathon to another, we're going to see things evolve and change, which is what they're for. And again, as IG and profiles are being built or updated. And now finally, where can we test? And I know Graham gave a great talk yesterday afternoon about testing with FHIR, which really touched upon a lot of the tools and resources from the FHIR specification and the community. What we're talking about here is more formalized testing environments. So we have things like the Aegis Touchstone environment, which I'm going to be demoing later. But the MITRE Corporation, they've got Crucible, which has been around just as long, if not longer, than Touchstone. You've got Inferno, which is what ONC has certified as their testing environment. Rob Scanlon gave a great overview of Inferno on Monday. So if you hadn't seen that, I suggest you go back and take a look at that. Again, publicly available test servers, the Confluent site there. These are servers that are provided by the community, whether there's reference implementations like the Happy server, the FHIR server, Graham server, but other offerings as well too from various corporations and organizations that make these things publicly available. So you can do very simple peer-to-peer testing. If you're a client, there's probably a server out there that you could leverage, and vice versa as well too. If you have a server and you're interested in somebody testing, you may need to contact them, but there might be publicly available clients as well too to try them out. So as I said, Rob gave a great talk on Monday about Inferno, but Project Crucible has been around for a while. They do FHIR testing for the official versions, DS22, S23, R4. They do FHIR server testing for conformance to the standard. They also have a neat patient record quality and completeness type of suite that you could run as well too. As I mentioned, Inferno, Streamline FHIR testing platform for FHIR servers. Here, they're focused on the Smart on FHIR, bulk data, US core, international patient summary, and so forth. So please go check those out. I do want to spend my time, of course, talking about Touchstone, because that's what I'm going to be demoing here. So as a platform, Touchstone does implement the FHIR Testing Framework and the test script resource, as I described earlier. It provides basically a cloud-based TaaS, or testing as a service platform. We host numerous already written test script resources that do base and workflow testing for IGs as well as the base specification, but those IGs that meet regulatory requirements as well. It provides a platform for detailed and immediate feedback on your implementation. We can lower the cost of your development. So if you test early, test often, you start to find things early on. It's better to find things early before things get locked down and you have to go rework things. And then Touchstone also offers an API, a remote API, where we can support continuous integration, meaning that if you have, say, something like a continuous build server like a Jenkins or a Travis, you can integrate the Touchstone test execution API into that in your build jobs. Or you could use it for building your own interface if you so desire, if you have tooling that you wanted to use to access Touchstone remotely as well, too. We also support the official versions of FHIR, DSQ2, SQ3, R4. We host multiple FHIR validation engines that's available as internal services to Touchstone. So we've got a validation service for each FHIR's version. We actually have multiple validation engines because what we like to do is support the upload of different implementation guide validation packages. So we can have different validation engines running different combinations of uploaded packages for testing purposes. We do support FHIR client testing. So Touchstone itself can act as a client to do server testing, but it can also act as a man in the middle. So that if you have a FHIR client, we can start a test execution and it'll sit and wait for an incoming request from an external client. We can then test that incoming request and then send it on to the destination server and then see what the round trip looks like. So that gives us a nice peer-to-peer type of environment. From a specification perspective, we also support CDS hooks. We do support Smart on FHIR, bulk data testing, as well as OAuth 2, which is part of Smart on FHIR and bulk data. We've been working with FHIR accelerators like the DaVinci project, and we host their publicly accessible FHIR test scripts for their IGs, as well as those test scripts for program level support where you would sign up to have access to those. And then speaking about those programs, we're going to be focusing on the Drummond group's programs, most notably the FHIR Patient Access Certification, which is based on the CMS rules. They also have a program for ONC G10 EHR certifications. And another program we've been supporting for a number of years now is the MedMy program in the Netherlands, supported by NICTA. So I actually have here on our Aegis website links to where you can get to those pieces. So the MedMy here, if you want to get to the FHIR Patient Access, and this is where you can find out more about that program. And again, 21st Century Cures Act with the ONC G10 and so forth. So we have that information readily available to you. Let's see. There we go. So let's take a few moments here and focus in on that Drummond FHIR Patient Access FHIR Certification Program. Because that's what we're talking about here is certifying your applications based on federal requirements. So this one in particular is the one I want to focus on. Because basically what we're doing here is we're in partnership with the Drummond group to provide the testing platform for their accredited test lab and certification process so that they can be the independent validation and verification organization that you go to. So they're going to look at the testing results that come from Touchstone, and then they're going to be examining those for their certification program. So they can give you appropriate badges and certification, based on what you're testing for. So the program itself provides a nice roadmap to compliance. So there's a pre-certification access to policy and subject matter experts, test-driven development tools to build and validate solutions. So basically, once you sign up for the program, you're not just thrown into the deep end right away. We basically help you through the process and give you a lot of guidance. And so there's a lot of pre-testing that can be done here as well, too. So before you even get to that certification level of testing. What Drummond provides then is that independent certification seal of compliance. So based on their unmatched industry credibility and experience as an independent assessor. So these programs that I've mentioned are listed on the Drummond Certified Product Registry, and they do go beyond just initial certification. So we do strive to put in above and beyond additional testing for areas that might be of concern. Drummond also provides that streamline and consistent support. They are an ISO 17025, 17065 certified organization. And basically, as specifications and requirements evolve, we keep them up to date as quickly as possible based on, again, those rules and regulations and when things need to be supported. We also provide compliance monitoring for long-term success and risk mitigation. So it's all part of the program. So we can think of the actual program itself as this life cycle. So as we mentioned, when you sign up and you register for the Drummond Group's certification program, you're provided that pre-test support through subject matter experts and so forth. And then you're given access to the testing environment and to those test scripts that are available, grouped together appropriately. And then once you're into that cycle, into that test-driven development cycle, you can iterate through that, and go around and around, basically pre-certification, start testing, make sure things work, examine your results, go back, maybe have to rework some things, keep testing again. And at some point, you're going to be ready and you're going to notify Drummond and say, okay, I'm ready to go through the actual certification run. Once that happens and you've completed that, then those final results are then forwarded on to Drummond, where they review them, and assuming all is well, you're granted that certification seal and badge of compliance. Beyond that, then, ongoing compliance monitoring in the field is available, and so you can continue to test beyond just the base initial certification, so that you may have updates that are going on with your application. So you may deploy some new things. You want to go back and retest and make sure things are good. This is the FHIR program here. So when that FHIR organization returns for renewal testing, or if there's substantive changes to the standards, then you're going to come back and go through a recertification process and start the cycle all over again. So go back through the pretest, which hopefully won't take quite as long the second time around, and off we go again. So ultimately, what we're doing here is providing a mechanism for granting those seals and badges of compliance. So for the CMS Interoperability Patient Access Final Rules program with the Drummond Group, these are the timelines as put forth by CMS for compliance. So earlier in the year, in May, we had the admission, discharge, and event notification, and coming up real quick next month, we have the various patient access APIs, so basically claims and encounter data, drug formulary, clinical data, as well as the provider directory API. And so, these are the things that we currently have on the plate for testing purposes. As we get further closer to January 2022 and then on to 2023, additional aspects will be coming online. It's important to understand that underlying all of these are the Da Vinci implementation guides of pretty much the same name. So there's a lot of effort gone into ensuring that we have the correct packages installed for validation purposes based on which version of the IGs from Da Vinci we're using as well too. So with that, that takes us through a whirlwind tour of the FHIR Testing Framework, the reasons why we test, the 5 Ws, as well as an introduction to the Drummond Group certification program for CMS. What I'd like to do now is to drop into my browser, and there we go. And I've got our Touchstone platform sitting up here. Let me just click on the main link here. So if you go to touchstone.com, it'll redirect you to our actual hosted site here. And if you click on the Touchstone logo in the upper left here, that takes you to our landing page. And this is just, a place where you can find out some more information. So without even logging in, you've got access to some information here. Our online docs are available regardless of being logged in. So if I click on the docs section here, this is all HTML based and searchable. So if you want to find out how to register as a membership or subscription or set up a test system or execute tests, whatever it might be, our online docs will help you through that. What's also interesting is that the test definitions themselves, the test scripts that are available are available. So every publicly available test script that we've put together is out here and made accessible here, even though you're not logged in. So this tree view over here provides you access. Now, we do have our public folders here, which you can see we support connectathon testing of various sorts. We actually have some public bulk data tests here as well, too. Basic and advanced, these all go against the base FHIR specification as well. And you'll see we've got various flavors here based on FHIR versions that we support. The most notable thing we have here is something called a FHIR Sandbox. This is where you as an organization, when you have an account with us, can actually upload your own test scripts. And so as you start to develop your own testing paradigms and build them out as test scripts, you can upload them here into Touchstone. And then we have settings from a privacy perspective. So you'll notice these are all publicly accessible. So we can see there's some DaVinci ones here. And the DaVinci ones, if I go under 401, you can see here's some of those implementation guides. So these are the publicly available ones. These are not part of the certification program. Likewise, under Aegis, I've made accessible here the DevDays. I also have a tutorial for our online training that we do. But I also have some DevDays related test scripts here that are for demonstration purposes. So I'm actually going to use these a little bit here to kind of show you what we need to do. If you look over in the workspace area, you'll see we have the create test setup. So we have to choose one or more test scripts that we want to execute. So maybe I'm just interested in doing the capabilities statement test in syntax XML, let's say. And that's the only one I'm interested in. I could do more. But if I do a create test setup, and you'll see I'm not logged in. So I actually have to log in to gain access to that screen. So I'm just using my demo account here with Touchstone, and that gives me access. And so the test setup itself, we give you a name, because we're going to save these test setups. You can just go back and execute them again without having to go through all the setup process here. But the destination, this is a server-only test because we're just going to use Touchstone as a client and make a call using the metadata endpoint to a particular FHIR server. Well, which FHIR server do we want to use? I mean, I'll probably be using Wildfire here, and I want to make sure it's got the correct support for the right FHIR version here based on the test script that I'm running. But if I drop this list down, I've got a lot of choices here. Well, all of these test systems were made publicly accessible by the organizations that defined them. So you can see there's quite a few DaVinci ones here for a lot of the DaVinci testing. So these are reference implementations that are available from DaVinci, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm not going to test somebody else's server right now. I'm just going to stick with Wildfire, which is our Aegis reference implementation that we host for our own purposes here. And it's publicly accessible out there, so no worries if you go out there and start playing around with it. There are no additional variables or things that I need to set at this point because Touchstone is going to act as a client. I then just hit execute, and that's going to save that test setup with the name that was given, and then it's going to start executing the test. So now Touchstone, acting as a client, is going to start that pre-processing, setup, test execution, teardown, post-processing process, if you will. You can see I have 100% pass here, so we're all green. There's no little W's or anything, so no warnings, so that's good. What I'm looking at is a summary here at the test execution. So if I had multiple test scripts here, I'd see a list going down the page. But each test script itself, I can drill down into to examine the results of that execution. we provide a lot of summary information up at the top here. But then within the test script itself, there's one test that was defined, and that's for the capability statement for the metadata endpoint. And I can expand on this. So everything was successful, so by default, we leave it all collapsed, and you just simply expand it. And those expansion areas are typically going to be these little ellipses that you see here. So if I click on this, it's going to explode out and show more detail. So this is actually what Touchstone as a client sent to this URL. So it used my base URL and did metadata after it. It did a get, because this is the metadata or capability statement request. And then the only header that was sent is basically the FHIR MIME type for XML in this case. My server, of course, is going to send back more information, and you can actually see here's the payload that was returned, my capability statement, all right, is available to introspect here if you wish. And then a number of asserts that follow. Remember what I said about the asserts is they're little Boolean expressions that are going to be evaluated. And they can be evaluated on the request operation, so basically what the response is to the request, so the response code. In this case, I'm not doing any request-based asserting because this is a server test. Make sure that the content type that comes back is appropriate, so make sure that it's not empty. Make sure that it actually is what I expect it to be, that application FHIR plus XML, right? So you can keep expanding these things to kind of get a nice description of what these things have. We want to make sure we got the char set UTF-8 listed appropriately and so on and so forth. We can even do FHIR path expressions here. So in this particular case, I'm making sure that the capability statement REST exists where the mode equals server, right? So there's a little exists here. So that's going to evaluate to a true or false all on its own. And that's going to inform the assert of a pass or a fail. So I want to make sure that my server, my FHIR server, actually declares a capability statement with a REST entry with a mode of type server. And you can imagine you can drill down even further when we get into specific testing based on implementation guides. So that's kind of an idea of what we can do here with testing. Now, my demo account, and so I can go back over to test definitions here, and I can expand upon this. And if I look, you'll see that I still have that list that I saw before. I'm really only looking at the publicly available test groups, if you will. The certification program from Drummond, the test groups are only available when you register and you're granted access through Touchstone. So you're not going to be able to see those because they're being privately held against the Drummond group. Now, I could log in as a user that does have access to those, and just to do that very quickly, we'll see here's a lot more available here. So as an example, let's say the clinical data tests. Here we have a capability statement test, and it's a little bit different, right? We're actually looking for US core specific things. And so this would be an interesting test. If I were to run this against my wildfire server, do I comply with these requirements? So if I were to create the test setup now and run them against my wildfire server, let's see if I've got that set up correctly. Well, we'll let it refresh and let it pick up, and we'll wait for it, and ooh, we have a red. So if I drill down, we can see we have a failure. Well, don't be afraid of red. Red informs us. Oh, it's still processing, doing some post-processing, so I have to wait till it finishes here. There it goes. So you can see, the actual capability statement request was successful. I mean, I sent back my capability statement with a 200. It's the asserts that are going to potentially have a problem. Well, you'll notice here, it really only failed on one assert. I've got tons of asserts here. I mean, I'm looking for all kinds of US core supported resource types. But what failed? Well, you'll notice it's actually doing a TLS check. So it's making sure that I'm using an HTTPS endpoint that supports the appropriate secure transport layer. Well, my base test system in Touchstone for wildfire is using my unsecured endpoint. Well, that's interesting. So what if I go back to my test setup and I switch it over to use my secured version of wildfire, okay, where I have OAuth support and all kinds of good stuff. Well, if I execute this, and we'll let it run through the same process again, and we'll wait for it to finish. It's doing a lot. Those asserts take a little bit of time to run through, so we have to let it, finish up what it's doing. And hey, now we pass. Well, what's the difference? Well, the difference is my endpoint, if you look up here, is HTTPS, right? So as I said, this is my secured version of wildfire, where I do support HTTPS with the appropriate TLS level of security. So the assert that failed before is now passing because I'm using the correct endpoint where I indicate support for that TLS. So that's just an example of, showing you, it's like this particular test system failed because it wasn't using a particular thing correctly. So something to keep in mind. So that's just kind of a whirlwind tour of some of the features that we have here in Touchstone. Other areas of interest is once you do get into the certification programs, is we have these conformance suites that are available. And the conformance suites, again, these will be opened up to you based on your registering with the Drummond group. And here I can go in and I can say, well, here's all the provider directory tests that I need to do. So we've created these conformance suites where I can take, it remembers the last server that I was using. So here's my secured server. So I haven't run any of these things, right? So I'm all gray right now. But I could come in here and I could actually execute the first test, which is, there it goes, and it finally refreshed. And so it's now executing this. And if I actually go into history, I can see, here it is, OAuth 2 authorized, right? So I'll go into the test, and now notice it's actually going through the authorization step, right? So if I continue this, right, I now have to actually log in. I have to credential into Wildfire. And so I don't believe I have my credentials saved. So I'm actually going to put in some bad credentials, right? And so it's invalid, right? So it's not going to let me in. Invalid username or password. So this is my public system here, so I have to be able to send it in the correct thing. But essentially, if I go back, right, I'll stop that process and just stop the test. So you're not going to be able to execute this unless you have the right credentials. So just be aware of that. So this test is testing the OAuth capabilities that you might have. So I notice we're running short on time here, so I do want to come back in and just kind of do a quick review. We went through very, very briefly the FHIR Testing Framework, also validation testing, the importance of it, and then a quick demo here of the Touchstone platform and how we're supporting the Drummond certification programs. I do want to leave you with a quote from Aegis Interop guy, our own Mario Highland. The future of testing is that we are not simply testing for today, meaning the IG or version of the standard we are working with today. It's too limiting a view. Rather, we're preparing our testing approaches and testing infrastructure for the future of testing when our FHIR community is significantly more complex. So we are planning for the future with what we're doing here. So just please be aware of that. We do have a couple minutes, so if there is Q&A here, question and answer, but I do want to provide you with those links again that I was showing you to the Drummond group, as well as to Touchstone as a platform. So I don't know if I see any questions or so forth.
As far as I know, there are no questions in the Q&A section. So if anyone does have a question, please raise your hand and then we can ask you to unmute.
I don't see anybody.
No, seems that you were very clear there, Richard.
Yeah, all right. Well, thank you, everyone. So my contact information is here. So I'm available through the Whova App Speakers Gallery, my email address with aegis.net, and I am on Twitter as Technoman. And I did not make up that name for myself. My family did. So I'll leave you with that. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your final day of DevDays.
Thank you, Richard, for that session. And also for me, enjoy the